All right. Apologies, everybody. Sorry for the tech problems. I am not sure what's going on. The number is 104-517. And I'm going to have to do this in Google Slides, which may drive me to drink. Okay. Yeah, and Slido changed just yesterday also, so. Okay. Thanks for suffering with me. I want to talk today about what motivated the North-South rift over this slavery in the 1860 election. To a certain extent, this whole class has been about the attempts to hold off this tension between the North and the South, going all the way back to the English Civil War and the reasons for colonization, right? North and South, the kinds of people who move in the North and kinds of people who move in the South, the issue of slavery. But this is a kind of burning question for historians. What motivates civil war? What goes from being a sort of tension to being a party ip and ultimately a cause for war. And so I want to talk about some explanations for that. But let me just first say a little bit about the election of 1860 and how it works. The Democratic Convention for the choice of the Democratic candidate started in April of 1860 in Charleston. Through the presidency of James Buchanan, which had been from 1856 to 1860, there was a sense on the part of Northern Democrats that the Southern Democratic Party, the presidency, that Buchanan was sort of controlled by Southerners. They used the term dough faces to describe these Northern Democratic presidents who seemed to be in the pockets of Southerners. Dough faces was literally what theater actors put on. They put on dough faces to act, and so the idea was that these Northern Democrats weren't Northern at all, and they were basically in the pockets of Southern Democrats. And so there's a battle between Northern and Southern Democrats about who to choose. The Northern Democrats support Stephen Douglas. Remember, he's the person who's the architect of that, of the land system, the system for doling out land to railroads, the railroad land grant system. And they support popular sovereignty in Kansas and Missouri. Douglas wins the nomination, but 8 southern states walk out, believing that Stephen Douglas will not support them. Those delegates adjourn and reconvene in Baltimore. And they meet 1 week later, and they choose Vice President John Breckinridge of Kentucky. The Whigs, the Know-Nothings, and some Democrats form something called the Constitutional Union Party, and they nominate John Bell, a wealthy Southerner from Tennessee. And so we have Whigs, we have the Constitutional Union Party, we have the Democratic Party, and we have this party, the Republican Party, all competing in the 1860 election. 4 different presidential candidates. Most of them think that the election will end up in the House of Representatives, just like it had in 1824, and that it would be decided by Congress. That doesn't happen. And when Lincoln is chosen by the Electoral College, we see war. So let's talk a little bit about why that is. Why did supporters of the Union crystallize behind the Republican Party? Why is it that this third party, the Republican Party, that had run in 1856 with John Fremont, had gotten something like less than 5% of the vote, why does this party become the popular party? Remember that you've got another party called the Know-Nothings that seem to be sweeping the North. It seems that the Whig Party is shrinking in terms of size. Well, part of what the Republican Party does is it is not opposed to slavery, the Republican Party, but it is opposed to the expansion of slavery into the West. And it increasingly takes on some of the features of the Know-Nothing Party. In particular, the idea of the wide-awake eye, the party that's going to defend the Union against external threats. The external threats in this case are, to a certain extent, Irish Democrats, but also a slave power. They kind of unite this in this sort of idea of the wide-awake eye. Bear with me here for a second while I jump ahead. So, for example, the Republican Party creates something called the Wide Awake Club, which anyone can join. Any young man can join. You don't have to be a voter. You don't have to be 21. And lots of people joined this organization before the 1860 election. As you can see here, the wide awakes in the Republican Party, their plan is to converge on Washington in 1860 and to defend the inauguration of the president against a cabal of Southerners and Irish Democrats who might overturn the presidency and prevent the sort of elected officer from being emerge. One historian and a bunch of others have called this the free labor ideology that comes to dominate the Republican Party. And let's look a little bit at this. You see the wide awake eye in the front? That's a direct ripoff from the Know-Nothing Party, a reference to George Washington, "Let none but Americans sleep tonight." This idea of vigilance. It's a kind of quasi-military organization, the Wide Awake Club. If you look at the bottom here, there's some symbols. You've got the eagle at the top, who's supposed to be holding the fig leaf in one hand and the arrows in the other, but the fig leaf is missing. What else do we see in this image that might make us think that this is a kind of argument about what's going on in the Union? What are some of the other things you see in this image that might suggest why it is that people become attracted to this new Republican Party? I know it takes people a little bit to... Farmers and industry. Good. So you see on the right there, you've got a farmer who's splitting rails to put up a fence, and he's clearly a farmer. He's got big, powerful arms, but in the back you see industry. And the idea is that industry and farming might be threatened by the slave power in the South. What else? Besides farmers and industry? Thank you, Stephen. Oh, and I'm not the administrator here. This is going to be fun. Okay, chains at the bottom and left, broken chains, excellent. On the bottom left, which is it's a somewhat discrete, or maybe not that discrete reference to slavery. You'll notice that the chains are on the left, and that is the West, presumably. You've got the eastern cities on one hand, and the western plains on the other. And the the gesture here is probably no slavery in the West, right? No slavery in those Western territories. Support for railroads that go to the West. Lincoln himself was a railroad lawyer and specialist in property conflicts with the railroads in the West. He believed that Southerners had too much power in Congress. Okay, so this free labor ideology is a kind of, remember that ideology, when we talk about ideology, it's often a kind of unspoken or kind of deep feeling that people have. That's the thing that rivals them, but they don't necessarily see it as ideology. It's a kind of framework through which they view the world. So free labor ideology, this idea that there ought to be free labor in the West, that there ought not to be slavery in the West, is an important part of this. Another argument about what motivates people to join the Republican Party very quickly in 1856 and 1860 is the sense that a slave power dominates Congress. And this, as I've suggested, is probably true. It's probably true that the F Street mess had really dominated Congress, even though they represented a minority of Americans. That this group of senators and representatives, because they controlled both the House or had seniority in both the House and the Senate, could block or stifle any westward bill, any bills for free land in the West, for example, which the Republican Party supported. Not just cheap land in the West, free land in the West was an important Republican Party platform. The support for public education, using basically the most valuable land in the West, giving it to the states and allowing the states to build land-grant universities is another policy that's promoted by the Republican Party. Southern Democrats blocked both of these in Congress and had been from the 1850s forward. So this idea that the slave power kind of gets its way no matter what is probably also an important thing that motivates people to join the Republican Party in the North. Another thing is that while the Democrats and the Whigs in the party system that starts around 1824 and ends or is kind of on shaky ground in the 1850s and 1860s, while they refuse to talk about slavery, there's a growing proliferation of kind of cultural productions which are aimed at calling attention to slavery. This includes farmers' almanacs that are anti-slavery, that are published for free by the Quakers. This includes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which becomes an overnight success, is translated into 55 languages in the space of a year. It's the only book that outsells it in the 19th century is the Bible. The second most popular book is The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, which is a sort of dime novel about rape inside a Catholic monastery, so a sort of anti-Catholic tract. But as you can see, both of them are kind of designed to tug at people's heartstrings to make them question slavery. So that's another explanation, is that women and kind of outsiders, to a certain extent, are capable of raising this issue that neither party is willing to deal with. Another explanation is the explanation you have in the textbook, which is Harry Watson's explanation, which is the collapse of the Whig Party. And I can't find an image because it's such a lame argument. No, sorry, that's a joke. But the point is that for Watson, the Whig Party starts to shrink in size, and there has to be some replacement for it. And the Republican Party sort of naturally slots into place. Now, there are a bunch of problems with this. One of them is, what about the Know Nothing Party? Another is, what about the sort of Constitutional Union Party? Aren't there are other parties that are kind of floating around? Why this relatively small but well-funded Republican Party rises to the surface is another question entirely. I'd like to suggest that it's that an important part of what powers the Republican Party is many of these people who support, I call them the boulevard barons, the railway barons who are wanting to build railroads into the West. They fund the Loyal Republican Society pamphlets and others that attack the slave power. They're become crucial supporters of the Republican Party. And they kind of articulate, on the one hand, the desire for free land in the West, the free labor ideology, and at the same time, why it is a slave power prevents that from happening. So I'd suggest that it's some combination of the sort of sense that a slave power is control of Congress and a sense that there's so much that the Union could do if it had access to, if the Southerners weren't so powerful in Congress. If we could, for example, build universities in every state, if we could, for example, give out free land in the West, if we could have the most valuable land sold the railroads for free settlers. It seems ironic that the Republican Party would both support railroads in the West where they can sell land and giving away free land. But the idea of the free land was that this would be in kind of drier areas, not directly along the lines of the railroad, but that these land should be given out for free to settlers. Okay. The other question is, why would non-slaveholders, non-slaveholding whites, support a civil war, kind of leave the Democratic Party and create their own Southern Democratic Party? Why would they be involved in, and why would they, in fact, they fight in this war? And so those two questions are kind of related. Why would they leave and create the Southern Democratic Party, and why would they fight? And there's a few explanations that people have for this. I mean, the central question is, if this is a war of slavery and it's over slavery, and it's clearly about slavery, maybe let's define it slightly more carefully, the expansion of slavery in the West. That's really what the war is about. Can slavery exist in Kansas? That's primarily the issue that the Republican Party supports. But how does a war over the expansion of slavery into the West, how does that, why do white Southerners who don't own slaves, why in the world would they support a war? Why would they vote for the Southern Democratic Party? Why would they fight for a Southern Democratic Party when they have no direct interest in supporting slavery in the South? Does that make sense, that question, right? So one answer to that question is the Golden Circle, the idea of the Golden Circle, which is heavily promoted in Texas. This, in fact, the whole annexation of Texas is connected with a group of people who come to call themselves the Knights of the Golden Circle, referring to the Crusades. This idea that it would be a crusade for the land all the way around the Gulf of Mexico. The land that's best for producing cotton and sugar and coffee. But cotton and sugar are the primary things at this point that people are talking about. And so the idea of the Golden Circle, which is also a secret organization, very much like the Wide Awakes, the idea behind the Golden Circle is that Texas was good, but it's not quite enough. That the United States should buy land in Yucatan, it should buy Cuba, it should create a Golden Circle, which is in a kind of perfect place for the production of cotton. It's actually down here in Yucatan, that's in the Yucatan Peninsula, that cotton initially was grown in the 10th or 11th century, if not earlier. So cotton grows perfectly in the American South, but it also grows perfectly in Yucatan. It also can grow in Cuba. and there's slavery in Cuba. And the idea is that there could be a whole golden circle of wealth. And with that golden circle, poor white men will be able to own slaves and become wealthy on their own. That's the whole principle behind the Knights of the Golden Circle. And the Golden Circle argument is, yes, only something like, the percentage of white people who own slaves is something like 30 to 40%, depending on which state you're talking about. Yes, there are a lot of non-slave holding whites, 60 to 70%, but those people might be able to own slaves if the territory for slavery were expanded all the way around the Golden Circle. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's one argument, is that the best poor man's choice, poor white man's choice, is to have even more slavery, right? It's like more cowbell. More slavery is going to provide opportunities for white Southerners. So a number of historians who make this argument. The Southern states do push very strongly for the annexation of Cuba in 1857 in the middle of the financial panic, at a time when lots of Northerners want some sort of bank reform or something like that. The South says, oh, the solution to our problem is not bank reform, the solution to our problem is more slavery, right? Let's annex Cuba. So that's the Golden Circle argument. Another argument is the Herrenvolk democracy argument. Herrenvolk's a German word, and it's loosely translated as kind of master race. And that is this idea that poor white Southerners may not own slaves, but they own a little bit of land, some of them, and they're masters of their own little worlds. They're masters of small worlds. No one is allowed to move into their region. They have complete control. They dominate Southern, white men dominate Southern women. Southern white women. They may never have slaves, but it's this desire for freedom that requires there to be black people below that motivates the Southern Democratic Party and motivates white Southerners who are not slaveholders to support the Confederacy. Does that make sense? Does that argument make sense? The way that James Henry Hammond puts it, the person who said cotton is king, is there's always got to be a bottom rail. There always has to be a bottom rail on any fence, and that fence, the bottom rail of the fence is a dirty rail. The bottom rail of the fence in the North, according to James Henry Hammond, is poor white men and women who work in factories day and night. There's poverty in the streets. The bottom rail, according to James Henry Hammond, in the South is black people. And as long as the bottom rail in the South is black people, white people are better off. Even if they have no land, even if they have no wealth, even if they have nothing, they're better off. This argument it's hard to find this argument in the letters of Confederate soldiers. There is definitely a kind of strong racist sentiment, but whether this idea that I'm better off because black people are worse I know it's an argument. It's one way of kind of thinking about the coming of the Civil War, is that non-slave holding white Southerners want there to be someone who is worse off than them. It kind of works psychologically, but it's a little bit difficult in the sources to find. A third argument for why white Southerners support a Democratic Party that's inclined to leave the convention at Baltimore, and go their own way to try to create a new Southern Democratic Party are these three dudes: Lawrence Keitt, Albert Gallatin Brown, and William Lowndes Yancey, people who were very much outsiders in the Democratic Party in the 1840s and 30s. They were, unlike the rest of the Democratic Party, wanting to talk about slavery all the time, right? Democrats and Whigs did not like to talk publicly about slavery. But Keitt, Brown, and Yancey said, there is a war. It is coming. Be prepared. And so in the 1830s and 40s, people laugh at these folks. They are themselves young men, powerful speakers. They are in a weird kind of psychological position because they don't actually own the plantations that they're connected to. They are in their 20s and 30s, but their fathers are in their 60s, and the fathers still own the plantation. The father still owns all the enslaved people. The father still owns everything. And there is this idea among some political historians that there's this group of enslaved sons who want to be slaveholders, but are held back by their fathers in a kind of perpetual, or not perpetual, but a long state of immaturity, where they're kind of living in their parents' houses, waiting for their father to die so that they can become slaveholders themselves. Does that make sense? And that this overheated rhetoric that we associate with these three people appeals increasingly to those young men, white young men who vote, who feel disaffected and angry and upset with the two-party system. Does that make sense? So again, it's a psychological explanation, but it is true that these fire eaters, as they're called, very much the fringe part of the Democratic Party, move right into the center of the Democratic Party once it's clear that war is on the horizon. Okay. All right. Finally, and this does show up in the letters of Confederate soldiers, is fear of a black army. Is fear that all this talk of abolition that's been floating around the United States from the time of the Haitian Revolution forward, as Mexico ends slavery, as every other state in the Western Hemisphere abolishes slavery, Argentina, that with the exception of Brazil and the exception of Cuba, Cuba and Brazil remain slaveholding places, but slavery is abolished between the 1820s and the 1840s. The fear is that a Republican Party might draw on a black army and that this black army will do horrible things in the South. And you do see white men's letters to their wives talking about the fear, the danger of a black army, a black Republican army, an army that the Republican Party can call forth that will threaten their livelihoods, that will threaten them. Does that make sense? Okay. This is strong stuff. This is, so we have 4 candidates for the presidency in 1860. Everyone, including Lincoln, thinks that this is going to go probably to the Congress for them to decide. There's a lot of discussion about if this does go to Congress with 4 parties, it'll be just like 1824, except that maybe there will be some compromise. Maybe there will be some constitutional amendments which defend slavery in the South, for example. And so there's a lot of talk about this after, as the election is coming to a head in 1859. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins not just the popular vote, but the Electoral College vote. So he's obviously, he gets 40%, which is comparable to Jackson's victory. But in the Electoral College, he does much better. In the Electoral College, he gets 59% of the vote. He gets 180 votes. He effectively sweeps the Northeast, not just New England, but also Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa. He sweeps California and Oregon. And what we get is almost a purely sectional vote. Maryland and Delaware don't vote for Lincoln. Lincoln is not even a candidate in North Carolina or Tennessee, anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line. He's doesn't even have enough votes, doesn't even have the 2,000 or 3,000 votes that he needs to get on the slate in those southern states. But he wins in the North. And it's at this point, before he's inaugurated, that there's a question about what to do. What will be the compromise? What will be the thing that might, how does this upset even happen? As Danny Yates says, how does this upset even happen? It seems impossible. Well, part of it is, let's go back to look at who votes. So New England is increasingly persuaded that its Whig party is failing and that the Whigs cannot be trusted. The Whigs sort of cave every time there's an issue, and so part of that's partly why they're strong in New England. If you look at Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, those states absolutely depend on railroads to the west. They hope to be like New England and Philadelphia were in the 1830s and 1840s. They hope to be the big cities, to have the big cities that are going to connect to the rural west. And the idea of free land in the West, the idea of popularly supported and basically free public universities in the West is something that's very appealing to them. And so we do see a massive disaffection, a massive shift on the part of many voters who had been Democrats their whole lives, switching to the Republican Party because they believe, first of all, that Stephen Douglas sold them out in trying to, making this deal with the F Street mess. And they believe that the Republican Party is the only party that's committed to making poor men better off by giving free land in the West, by making university education possible. That's, I think, a solid explanation for this upset. But it is an amazing upset, right? A third party that wins the presidential nomination. And partly that's because it becomes increasingly sectional, right? That the Southern Democratic Party is clearly a Southern party. The Constitutional Union Party, which is a few Whigs and others, is really a kind of Southern Whig party. Popular among the places that had been the supporters of Whigs, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. Another place that had Whigs was coastal South Carolina, but they, it becomes Democrats there. And then the only place that supports Stephen Douglas, who is the heir apparent, is Missouri. Okay, so it's an astonishing upset. And the question is, will there be a constitutional amendment? Will there be constitutional amendments? Will Congress resolve some of these questions? The fear is, what is the fear? The fear is that the president's not the most powerful person in the United States probably in the 1860s. The most powerful person in the United States probably around 1860 is still Speaker of the House. The president has some military powers, has some police powers, but is not the kind of person that we associate with tremendous action that we do in the 20th century. That's kind of Teddy Roosevelt and after. That's 1901 and after. We have strong presidents. But Lincoln does appoint the Postmaster General. Postmaster General does appoint postmasters in every southern state, Republican postmasters in every southern state. And will they let abolitionist mail through? Yes, they will. Free abolitionist mail, free copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin, free copies of those Quaker farmers' almanacs that describe the horrors of slavery. Yes, they will. And so part of it is just this sense that the South is in danger, the South is surrounded, the South is threatened by a Republican Party. The Southern Democratic Party has become a party that's opposed to free speech. Elihu Washburn writes to Lincoln in 1860 asking him where there can be compromise. And he says, as you see, prevent as far as possible any of our friends from demoralizing themselves and our cause by entertaining propositions for compromise of any sort on slavery extension. In other words, defending slavery in the Southeast, saying that a constitutional amendment that defends slavery in Virginia and South Carolina and Mississippi and Louisiana, that's fine. But no slavery extension. No slavery west. No slavery in Kansas. There is no possible compromise upon it, but which puts us under again, right? Under who? Under the slave power. And leaves all our work to do over again, to build a coalition. Whether it be a Missouri line, that is the north-south slavery line, or Eli Thayer's popular sovereignty, let the territories decide whether they are free or slave, it is all the same. Let either be done, and immediately filibustering and extending slavery recommences. What's filibustering? Filibustering is what's happened in Mexico, in Texas, right? Filibusters is what's happening, is planned in Nicaragua, in fact. Filibustering is where you send over armed people into another place, have them settle, and then shoot anyone that gets in their way. That's what's happened in Kansas. That's what happened in Texas. Filibuster is a Dutch word meaning freebooter, meaning pirate. And filibustering is basically what's led to bloodshed in Kansas. On that point, hold firm as with a chain of steel. No slavery in the West. We will not compromise on this issue. And Congress cannot get a compromise that Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs will support. Support for just slavery in Mississippi and Virginia and Alabama is not enough. They need to expand as they see it. They will not compromise there. I'll talk about how this conflict leads to civil war in the period between when Lincoln is chosen as president, he wins the Electoral College vote, and when he's inaugurated. That 4-month period is critical, and it's part of the reason we don't have a 4-month period anymore between the inauguration and the election and the inauguration, is because it's potentially dangerous, because there's 4 months where the old guy has a tremendous amount of authority. We'll talk about how that leads to civil war the next class. Thanks. Yes?
What,
questions?
I have one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we got time.
What role did population growth in play in that higher electoral college?
Population growth. Population growth is important. The census provides more votes in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, which had benefited from the railroad land grant period in the 1850s. So yeah, that's an important part of this. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
I just have a question on the final.
Oh.
I know it said on the syllabus that it's at 8 a.m. Is it the same format as? Okay.
Yeah. So I'll post it on ELC, the same thing. So
okay. So you don't come here.
You don't come here and do it. Yeah. I'll just post it at 8 a.m. It'll be due 24 hours later.
Thank you.
So okay.
And
Thanks.
then after this class, I'm a history major.
All right. Cool. You're a history major?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I think after this one, I like to focus more on the Civil War. Like
Yeah.
That's what I'm interested in. But I have to do my university requirements.
Right.
After this one, I think I'm gonna take the East Asian history. But it's got, I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but it's in the same time, it's both got honors and non-honors.
Oh.
And I'm an honors student, so I was going to take the honors section, but I didn't know if you knew if it's the same class, just kind of different curriculum between the two.
That's a good question. I don't know. The person to ask is Ari, not Kelman. What is his last name? Ari. The person who's teaching the East Asian. It is Ari in both cases. Ari.
No, I think it's
Yang.
It starts with a T. His first name starts with a T. I think it might be Yang.
Oh, Tim Yang. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So Tim Yang. Oh, I see. So he's teaching the honors, and somebody else teaching the regular one.
No, it's they're both at the same time.
They're both at the same time.
So
I don't know. I can if you. Hold on. Oh, let me end the streaming here.